Welcome to our deep dive today as we learn more about John Cam, who was one of the movers and shakers and prime founders of the Quaker movement in England. And we are using this anniversary of his death that happened on March 18th, 1657, as part of our conversation today. And we are glad to have Professor Steve Angell join us, who is professor of Quaker Studies at Earlham School of Religion in Richmond, Indiana. So, Professor, thanks for joining us today.
Really glad to be with you this day.
Well, tell us a little bit about what was going on in the Quaker movement at this particular time frame. George Fox is certainly a name that might be familiar to anyone who is kind of doing at least a cursory review of trying to understand about Quakerism. But why John Cam? What was important that he did to the movement, and give us any background of any of that would be relevant.
Well, George Fox is certainly reckoned as the founder of Quakers. He was in 1652, 28 years old. He had been on the road since 1643, so about 9 years. Um, Fox and eventually Cam um, were very concerned about the the lack of what they saw as a genuine ministry in the Church of England. They were very worried about the bookish sermons. They were worried about the clergy um, and their you know uh, their very lavish lifestyles and social climbing. But they were most worried about the fact that the Church of England didn't do anything to really, in their mind, encourage um, uh, virtue and discourage vice among people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in the north of England, where Cam lived, there was an extensive movement of people called the Seekers, who thought that the church had become completely apostate
Mm.
and withdrew from everything, looking, the sacraments, everything appertaining to the church ritual, and they just met together, but they met in silence.
Ah.
Um,
Because that would have been illegal, right? Wouldn't it have been illegal for them to do that, or no? But only as
um,
a church it would have been illegal, or preaching would have been illegal.
that
So
that's
when you
that's
off
a
the,
that's a good question, and when you look at the broader context of the time in 1640s and 1650s, you realize that there's a civil war going on in
right,
England.
right,
Between different kinds of Anglicans and the Puritans, or the godly as they thought of themselves,
mm-hmm.
had the upper hand. Uh, King Charles, that time King Charles II, we now have
Right.
King Charles III, but King Charles II uh, didn't want to keep any of the agreements that he made with Parliament. So eventually, the lead general among the Puritan parliamentary forces, Oliver Cromwell, chopped off Charles's head, 1649. So about 3 years before the events we're talking about. But suffice it to say that England was in chaos, and any laws against the religion that was not approved by the state um, were only being enforced sporadically.
Mm,
Um, in the north of England in 1652, um, to the surprise of, I think, people throughout the nation, thousands of these seekers and other radical Christians um, adopted a religion very similar to that being advocated uh, by George Fox, namely that Christ has already returned, and Christ has returned not outwardly but in our hearts. Um, and so, he uh, urged everybody to turn to the inward teacher and to attend to the pure light of God in their consciences. Um, and so, most of what um, was thought of as Christianity, which was not um, not denied outright by Quakers, but was turned in, was spiritualized. So instead of having sacraments, baptism by water, and bread and wine for the Lord's Supper, those were things to be experienced inwardly.
mm,
So the main sacrament for Quakers was their form of worship, which built on this worship from the Seekers. So, like the Seekers, the Quakers met in silence, but they were also, you know, with their confidence that Christ has returned and Christ is in each of our hearts. Christ may actually uh, leave a message for each of us to share, for any of us to share with the rest of the group. So out of the silence, God, Christ could lead somebody to share often a short message. Fox's messages were often a little longer. He had a lot to say. John Cam too. Um, but after the message is over, then the group returns to the silence. And the worship in those days, nowadays among Quakers, the Quakers that practice this form of worship, the worship lasts about an hour, but in those days it lasted 3 hours.
wow.
So
Wow.
it was pretty extensive. Um, so Fox came through the north of England in 1652. He stopped at a place called Swarthmore Hall near Lancaster. And one of his most notable converts there was a woman by the name of Margaret Fell, who was a wife of a judge with 8 children and a very capable theologian and organizer in her own right. Fox came to depend on her a great deal. Um, the judge himself never converted to Quakerism, but he protected Quakers in the area.
Mm,
So that was pretty crucial because the in many parts of England, the authorities came down very strongly on Quakers, but not in this northwest part. Um, so Fell protected them. Judge Fell protected them. Judge Fell died in 1658, and 11 years later, Margaret Fell married George Fox. Yeah.
ah, okay.
So, um, but from Swarthmore Hall, where the Fells lived, Fox continued south to a place called the county is called Westmoreland. And this was where almost 3% of the population became Quakers. So it was a huge number of converts. One of the places in Westmoreland is a town, rural area really, called Preston Patrick. I was just there this summer. You can
Oh,
still see the sheep grazing on the hills. There is still a Quaker meeting the one that I mean that in roughly the place that John Cam would have attended, but it was built in 1869, so it was not the exact same
Okay.
building. But you know, if you go to Preston Patrick, you know, you get the idea of the countryside, you know, which would still look familiar to John Cam if he were here today.
Well, that's a great segue for you to tell us a little bit more about John Cam and knowing about who he was and why he was important to the whole part of the movement that was going on of the Society of Friends at that time. We're enjoying our conversation with Professor Steve Angell, who's professor of Quaker Studies, and we're talking about John Cam who was in England and an early leader. I think could be a right way to say it, right? Of Quakerism.
Well, John Cam was a prosperous farmer, and you know his son Thomas wrote that whatever he did with business, outward business, seemed to prosper, and fortune smiled on him. Uh, but you know um, when Fox came, John Cam, who was probably one of these seekers, was very powerfully affected, as was his whole family. You know, so his wife, his children, his servants all became Quakers, and uh, and subsequently they traveled throughout the out English throughout the British Isles, really. Um, you know, so he was a person who was highly respected. You know, thought of as one of the more dependable, the wisest of the leaders. He had a great gift for ministry, or as he would have said, the free gospel ministry, contrasting him with the priests who accepted the tithes. Um, and you know, so he and his entire family traveled throughout England, throughout British Isles. He went to Scotland. He went to London to visit with Oliver Cromwell. Um, but his most important ministry with his dear friend and yokemate John Audlin was in Bristol, which is in the southwest of England, and was probably the second largest city in England at that time after London. Um, Cam and Audlin came to Bristol, and they met with the Baptists and the Independents, who were other radical Protestants. And you know, the person who was most concerned about the Quakers, at least he he published a lot of criticisms of them, was a Presbyterian minister by the name of Ralph Farmer. And Farmer said, you know, these people by spiritualizing the gospel, by saying that, you know, Christ is in your conscience, Christ is a light in your conscience,
Mm-hmm.
Christ isn't a historical figure, by saying that you know, by talking about inward sacraments, you know, these people are not are he might have used the word like perverting the gospel. You know, these people are not teaching the true gospel. So what the disagreements, you know, and there were many between people like Cam and people like Farmer at this time, pointed out that, you know, yes, Quakers may be Christian, but it's entirely, you know, it's a very different form of Christianity than even the Puritans, who were pretty radical in their day, were used to.
Hmm.
Um, it was, and they were, the Quakers acknowledged the historical um, existence of Jesus, but didn't really place much emphasis on events that happened 1600 years earlier. The important thing now is Jesus come again in your hearts, in our hearts.
Hmm.
So uh, that gave a strong impulse to turn away from that which was evil and to turn towards that which was good. And the day of judgment is coming.
So would it be fair to say that Cam was um, kind of a self-financed missionary, if you will, that was spreading and connecting with others and telling more about kind of the way that about the Quaker beliefs of this inner light and the spirit, spiritual inside that they were doing? Would that be a fair way of saying that's kind of, was he sent out by somebody, or he just said, you know what, the other folks need to know, and I've got the means to go, and so I'll go? Is that a right way or not a right way?
Those are great questions and also hard to answer.
Okay. All right.
Because there's something for each of the alternatives that you mentioned. Um, the way that the early Quakers would express it is that the spirit of God is impelling me to go out to share the message. So King John Cam would not want to go where God did not want him to go.
Mm-hmm.
At
Yeah.
the same time, there was a network, and everybody knew where there were sympathetic listeners who might become, the Quaker term was, convinced of the truth.
Okay.
Um, you know, so um, so yeah, Cam certainly had the means to support himself, but with this network, um, there was never any money passed, but they made sure that the visiting friends who came to town, were fed, were
Okay.
lodged,
Okay.
so that it was really quite a powerful network. Um, John Cam and his friend John Audlin, one of the foremost evangelistic teams among early Quakers, had thousands of converts in Bristol. So it was a one of the strongest places outside the northern part of England where Cam and Audlin came from.
About that. Yeah. So for those of us that are uh, in the U.S., right? And anybody's got a rudimentary idea of, of U.S. history, right? We always think of the one Quaker we think we know, right? Which right, being William Penn. Did they get interacted somewhere with Cam, and would they have, because his time frame's obviously later than this, but I mean, were there things that Cam did or Auckland did during that time period that would have influenced those that connected William Penn to the movement?
So that yeah. So Cam, even though he had an enormous impact on Quakers in a very short period of time, he was 48 when he became a convinced friend. Um, at the time, he was already suffering from tuberculosis
Oh,
or
okay.
consumption, as they or it may have happened, a year or two later after his convincement. But at any rate, during his last few years, he was struggling with a very violent cough, um, and going ahead with his ministry, you know, even despite that, you know.
Mm.
So somebody today, if you had a cough, I'd say take care of yourself. Well,
Right.
John Cam didn't do that.
Okay.
You know, it was more important to spread the message. So, as you said at the outset, he died in March 18th, 1657. So, a little more than 4 years after he was convinced.
Wow.
He's 52 years old, which was, you know, uh, 20 years older than George Fox, and even older than many of the friends were even younger than Fox. Um, William Penn was born in 1644, so he would have been about 13 years old when John Cam died. Um, Penn spent most of his younger years, as a resident of Ireland, where uh, his colonizing father, had a big estate. And in 1667, so 10 years after Cam's death, it was in Ireland that Penn heard a Quaker minister, Thomas Lowe, preach a message that was so powerful that it reached the young Penn's heart, and and he became a convinced friend. Um, his father, William Penn Sr., was an admiral and very much opposed to his son becoming a Quaker.
Right.
Uh, Immediately summoned him home, and uh, if you look, and his father was in London at the time. If you look at the map, you'll see that Bristol, which was where Cam spent most of his ministry, is pretty much on a direct line from Cork in Ireland, where Penn was, to London, where his father wanted him to come. And so he stopped in Bristol, and one of the chief converts of Cam and Audland was a old parliamentary captain by the name of George Bristol. Sorry, George Bishop in Bristol. Well, George Bishop uh, wrote a letter to his old, old military comrade, the elder Penn, and
Okay.
said, I mean, your son. This is really he's really improved. This is really a great change in his life. Please have mercy on him. Um, so there are connections that way. There are connections. Both John Cam and William Penn were very closely related to, close associates of George Fox. So there are lots of connections that way.
I got you.
Um,
Yeah. Well, that makes some sense then. At least that puts it in some more kind of context as well, right? I mean, about how
mhm.
that would you say that folks who are Quakers today that are starting to learn more about the history and want to know more about how it came together, if they were going to do a top 10 list of the top 10 Quakers that you ought to know, do you think Cam makes that list because of the movement and the work that he did? Your opinion,
That's
I guess, your
yeah.
list.
What I would say is, when you look at George Fox and his associates, that there were, at least a few dozen friends who were almost of the same spiritual stature as Fox.
Hmm.
Um, and so in my scholarly work, one of the books I edited was early Quaker um, theologians, early in their theological thought, came out from Cambridge Press in 2015. My co-editor and I, Ben Pink Dandelion, uh, we included 15 uh, Quakers in that.
Okay.
Um, John Cam was not one of them. but
Okay.
he could have. I mean, he's of similar stature than the others, but as you point out, one of the people who was, both George Fox and William Penn were in the book, who had
Yeah,
much longer periods of ministry.
sure.
So, part of that is just an accident of who survives.
Yeah, right. It's kind of hard to share and spread and find others who would be convinced when you are not taking care of your tuberculosis or whatever else is going on, right? It kind of probably
Yeah.
put a damper on things, right?
Right.
On part of that to do. What a fascinating time, and what an interesting time as well to understand, um, how different people are able to understand their own, as we like to say, part of the reason that we do the Center for Christian History is to help other folks understand how they do their own worship, how they do their own sanctification, how they do their own salt and light, right? And so if understanding the history of how those things came together help people to understand that for their own benefit, then hot diggity dog, right? And this is yet another great example for us to be able to share of just the differences of the things that are there, of the way that people view their relationship with God. So thank you for taking some time. Anything we haven't discussed that is something like a glaring, oh my goodness, we got to say this piece before we go?
Oh no, I think we've pretty well covered it. So
Okay, well, fantastic. Very fine. We're really glad to have Professor Angell be with us today to talk to us more about John Cam, and not only John Cam, but George Fox and others as it related to the very beginnings of Quakerism, and particularly knowing that he was there at the beginning, right?
was.
And moved even further on that about wanting to be able to share that with others. So, of course, you can follow along on our podcast on Spotify or Apple for This Week in Christian History, and stay in touch to learn more about the good information that we are bringing to folks every week. Take care.